Welcome to the Rural Pastor Podcast with your host, Andy Addis, and special guest, Mark Clifton.
We plant the seeds in the ground, though the fields have long been brown. But Lord, when will your harvest come in? I'm giving all I've got to give in the place where I've been sent. But will my labor make much difference in the end? Will no one ever know? Sometimes I feel so all alone. Like the prophet Jeremiah, you may be the one to go to the dying and the broken with a message of hope. To that church on the corner of that forgotten little town, to a room of empty pews where his love can still be found. You may never know of all the seeds you sow, but it just takes one willing soul to make him know.
Thank you, Chosen Road, for those incredible lines. We've been asked several times how to get that song, and it's I think it's just here on the podcast for right now. It'll one day be available, but welcome. My name is Andy Addis, and I'm the volunteer rural strategist for the North American Mission Board Replant Team, as well as the pastor of Crosspoint Church, a rural multi-site church. I'm here with our special guest, our weekly co-host. Would you please introduce yourself, sir?
Hey, I'm Mark Clifton. Glad to be with you from beautiful Baser, Kansas.
Kansas.
That's right, where it's always 75 degrees and no humidity 12 months out of the year. Great place.
In your basement?
I don't know. We have a beautiful patio, and about 3 days a year, it's a nice place to sit, but it's not too hot or not too cold. It's 3 days. 2 days in the spring, one in the fall.
That's it.
That's the way it works.
And you're never at home during those days. That's the way that works.
I'm never at home during those times. Yeah.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us here. If this is your first venture with us, welcome. This is episode 6 of the Rural Pastor Podcast, so I feel like we're just still getting our feet off the ground. But here at the Rural Pastor Podcast, we want to pour into, partner with, pat on the back rural pastors. We believe what you're doing is so important. I want to remember that you are not alone. And we have a website at the same name, theruralpastorpodcast.com. And we would love for you to, if you're listening to this podcast on any platform, if you go to the website, you can actually make comments and be part of a conversation episode by episode. We'd love for you to do that. There's a few of those already starting up, and it's been fun to hear words of appreciation or questions and things that can be answered, plus a number of resources, one of which is something that we're using as the basis for our conversation. There is a book called Do More Together, and it is an ebook that has the story of Crosspoint Church, which I've had the privilege of pastoring for 20 years, that talks about a number of things, growing from a small neighborhood church to a multi-site network. And one of the principles in that book is that biblical preaching, relationships, and vision are the holy trifecta of a healthy church. Now, last week we spent some time on biblical preaching. This week we want to talk about relationships and how important it is to be not just the pastor leader, but the pastor shepherd of a congregation. We're all about leadership now, but leaders who got nobody following them are just guys out on a walk, right? So we want to make sure that we are shepherds. And let me ask you, what's your best example of relational pastoring? Maybe one that you got to offer, one that you got to receive. But Mark, in your years, give us a story. Give us a throwback to some great relational pastoring.
Oh, man, there's so many of them, Andy, after 40 years of being a pastor. But I especially remember in my early years when I was like 18 and 19 in rural North Missouri, all these older farmers and their wives were part of our church. And being able to, I remember when they would, one lady had some very serious health problems, and she was having some real difficulties, and I was in college, and she called me when I was on campus late one night, and she said, Brother Mark, I really think I'm not going to make it, and I've got some issues. And so my roommate and I, we drove up there, and here I am, 18, 19 years old, and she's really relying on me as the pastor to help help pray with her and help her through these issues, help her husband through these difficult times. And it was like a light went on in my head at that point, or in my heart. And I realized, being a pastor, if this is what God's called me to do, this is what it's about. I mean, it's not about finding a large church and gathering a large group and having a career. It's about being present with people at the point of their greatest need. Amen. It's about walking through crisis with them. And if that's not something you embrace and you are called to, then you don't need to be a pastor. You don't need to be. It's not about just preaching. It's not about organization primarily. It's not. It is about, and I realized that night, this is what God's called me to do. And I'll be honest with you, there was some other issues in her life that I'm not going to talk about right now.
Thank you.
Because they were above my pay grade. All right. So I get in there that night. This is a true story. So I get in there that night. And it was like, okay, I'm 18 years old. This is way above my pay grade. So it's late at night, but I went to the phone and I called an elderly pastor who was one of my mentors. He was almost 80 at the time. And he's a man who led my dad to Christ. And he lived in the community. And I called him and I said, I always called him Uncle Bill, even though he really wasn't my uncle. And I said, Uncle Bill, I'm over here at so-and-so's house. And he said, are they having those issues again? And I said, yeah, they are. He said, don't worry, Mark. Don't worry, son. I'll be right over. And so he got in his car and he drove over. And I watched him handle this situation that was above my pay grade, so to speak. And I realized then I've got a lot to learn. And here's this 80-year-old pastor, and just watching him. I don't want to get too deep in the woods in that, Andy. But I look at that as a real pivotal point in my ministry. And from that point on, it's just been being with people through all kinds of things, through the death of children, which is the absolute hardest thing I've ever done, having the funeral of babies, stillborn, crib deaths, those kinds of things those are just really weighty kinds of things. Walking with people through the loss of their parents, helping in numbers of couples that are about ready to separate and divorce, walk through those situations, infidelity. And I've never pastored a church of more than 150, and I've had all of those things and many, many more.
Absolutely.
And so, just those kinds of relationships that a pastor has of caring for people. I remember somebody tweeted on Facebook, a well-known person, that in many communities, the Walmart is better run than the local Baptist church. And how unfortunate that is, that Walmart is better run than the local Baptist church. And my thought was, and the thought of some other people I talked with was, yeah, but Walmart isn't asked to walk with people through crisis in life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a whole different thing. And it can be a joy. It can also, obviously, it's what weighs us down. You hang out with sheep, you begin to smell like sheep. Their pain begins to stick to you, all those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, Andy, if you're not about relationships, if you're not about being in the thick of it with your flock, living with them, caring for them, being with them at the point of their greatest need, then you're really not going to be very successful as a pastor.
Yeah, everybody wants to be the Moses who leads them through the wilderness. We think that's the leadership model, but that didn't take place until he spent years at the campfires amongst them. There's amongst, then in front, and then above, and stages of ministry, but you never get past the amongst. You have to be there. Now, by the way, you, in just your little opening monologue there, you named, there's an article, I'll put it in the show notes here, by Lifeway, and it's the 3 healthy relationships every pastor should have, and you named all 3 of them. You have to be the pastor that leads others who are kind of following you. You have to have the partner relationship. That's your roommate that you woke up and drug with you. And then did you say it was your grandpa that met you?
My great uncle.
Great uncle.
Well, it is great uncle by marriage, but yeah, he was a mentor of mine.
And he showed you the way. So
yes,
every pastor has to have these 3 relationships. And sometimes we're overwhelmed by those we have to lead, and that's because we don't have enough partners and we're not being supported and taught by those who are above us. You have to have all 3 of those. And man, just in you offering that, you outlined all 3 of those and how necessary they are. So did you know that you were that smart, that it just happens that way?
I did not, but I do want to hear you'll have a better story. Give me your illustration of being a relationship.
Well, that's very sweet of you. Mine is, it's not about something that I got to do. It's something that was done for me. I was a young married, and Kathy and I were, our story is that we've been married almost 30 years now, and our first year was amazing. Our second set of 3 to 5 years were a nightmare, almost ended it, and since then it's been bliss. And it was during that difficult period she lost a family member, and she's from Oklahoma. We were in Hays, Kansas, and I had a pastor I was serving under. I was a youth pastor. His name was Tommy Henson, and I remember I took the weekend off because I had to go and be with her, and we were not in a great place, but was trying to be a good husband, and she was grieving. She's very familial. We got to this little Church of Christ, an old bar that they turned into a church, and it's an interesting place because the nursing mother's room was actually just a spinning love seat in the back of the sanctuary that had a drop-down Venetian blind that you could put down in front. I mean, it's old school. So we show up in this old church, just handfuls of people, but there in the back is Tommy Henson. He drove 8.5 hours not to be a part of the service.
Oh my!
But got done with church and hustled all the way down there. And he says, I just wanted to do this. And he hugged Kathy's neck. And I watched her weep, and then we sat and held hands, and when we got done, he didn't even say good. He waved. He says, you got time, family. You got family. I love you. And got in the car and drove home. Yeah. My wife to this day will say, you're a good pastor, honey, but you're no Tommy.
Wow.
Because that was everything to her. And it was just a relationship building presence. And that's really what we're talking about. It's not an expert ability, not the right thing to say. It's just being a pastor.
That's right. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of your emotional and your time, a lot of your emotional bandwidth. It really does. And your time. And again, you begin to hurt with your people, and you begin to feel their pain and feel their struggle. You get frustrated because you'd like to fix it, and you can't always fix it. You can't make the cancer go away.
That's right.
You can't take back the infidelity. You have to help them bury their child. Those things are really challenging and difficult for a pastor. But God will give you the grace, and you are the anointed under shepherd. He is the shepherd. You lean to him.
That's right.
He's the one that brings the peace. You don't bring the peace. He brings the peace. And you have to point them to him, and he has to bring peace in your heart too. But guys, if you avoid relationships, you're going to have a very difficult time being a pastor, especially in a rural church, but in any church. You have to embrace those relationships. And Andy, relationships take time. There's no shortcut to that. You can't, when we talk about replanting dying churches, we talk about the remaining members, that you overwhelm them with pastoral care, and you love them in a way they've never been loved before. And we talk about the fact that they say, well, how do you get these older people who are really resistant to change, really kind of bitter and dug in? And you don't do it by trying to beat them over the head. You don't do it by trying to make them feel guilty. You do it by loving them, spending time with them, listening to them. When I went to Warnell Road, we had 18 mostly elderly members, was all we had left in a church that seated 610. How do you make this transition? Well, I didn't do a very good job the first couple of years. I just tried to attract a bunch of new people, and nothing really worked. But then I began to say, you know what? I got 18 elderly folks here. How do we disciple these people? So I began to spend time with these elderly people. If Mildred likes to garden, I'd go walk around her flower garden and let her tell me all about her daylilies and how she was proud of them. Yep. If Forrest likes country music, I would go to the country music shows with Forrest and all those kind of spending time with them. There was no substitute for that.
Amen.
And doing the things they like to do and fellowshipping with them and asking them questions. Asking them how we, I do that all the time. Even out here in rural Kansas, I didn't grow up on a farm. I grew up in a county seat town of a small town, but I did not grow up on a farm. And so even now, I've got some guys in my church who are farmers, who are ranchers, who have cattle. And man, I'll go out and I'll say, how do you do this with the bull? What's the deal with this? And ask them those questions. And it's amazing how they want to tell you about their work. And when they begin to tell you about their work, you begin to understand them, and they make this connection. So It's really no more complicated than that.
And that's the key, that it is just about relationships. And you're an introvert. I'm an introvert. A lot of good pastors, because we do know how to study and get away. We're naturally introverts. So the people side, it does take effort. But don't trick yourself. An introvert doesn't mean you're not good with people. It just means it takes extra energy. And so,
That's right.
So you have to take that time and take that energy. But ministry happens at volleyball games at the high school. Ministry happens at parking lot meetings talking about the Royals. Ministry happens. One of my favorite memories of the early days here at Crosspoint was we got invited to take our little boys. They were tiny, right? 4 and 5 at that time, to this elderly couple's house. And they were just they said, what do they eat? Will they eat chicken? I go, yeah, Nathan eats chicken all the time. He was our picky one. He was the little one. And I'll never forget this moment. It bonded us forever. We were sitting there and he just wouldn't touch the chicken. And she just, little Miss Jeanette said, well, Nathan, sweetie, do you not like that chicken? And he leaned over to me. This was a sign of bad parenting. He goes, Dad, it has bones.
Well, you
man.
You just eat nuggets.
I guess I have never given you nothing but a Happy Meal.
I got to tell you too. My son was 6, and I was going down to Wichita to help get a church planted. I was driving from Topeka to Wichita, and so I was going to stay all night. The very first night we were going to go down there and meet with this group, and so I took my son Trenton with me. We were going to go together, and so we were going to stay at these people's house. I'd never met these people before, but they were one of the founding members of the new church. Another church was starting it, and so we were going to stay in their home. Well, we ended up in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in all of Wichita, a really beautiful, huge house, one of the largest homes I've ever seen. And so we pull into this big long driveway and we go in this beautiful front door, and it's got this big chandelier and there's white carpet in the dining room.
Oh no.
They take us back to this huge, gigantic, great room. And my son, he looked up that couple. They were in their 50s or 60s at the time. And he says, you people are really rich. And I was so embarrassed. And she kneeled down and she said, oh, honey, we're not rich. And Trenton wouldn't have anything of it. He said, do you live in this house? And she said, yes. Well, then you're rich.
Out of the mouth of babes.
That was the introduction to their church planter.
Well, but see, that probably forever, like it did with me and Mr. Dwayne and Miss Jeanette,
Yes.
that solidified forever that chicken has bones and you live in a rich house. It's a relationship builder. Speaking of, now we're talking about different kinds of relationships, and I think this is really important to note that a pastor can have different levels of relationships with people around him, and should. Jesus modeled this. There were the crowds, and then there were the disciples, but the disciples weren't the 12. Then there was the 12, and then I find it really interesting that out of the 12 was Peter, James, and John. Don't you know that got old after a while? Like, that one of the Thaddeus was like, Peter, James, and John, Peter, James, and John. They're always, we're cleaning up campsite, and they're off on the Mount of Transfiguration. Yeah. But then even out of that, there was one that Jesus called the Beloved. And so we see that there are different relationships that even Jesus had. Now, I've given these different categories. Mine are Walmart, church, porch, and kitchen. Right? Okay. I think in a pastor's life, there are people at Walmart that are going to call you pastor that don't go to your church, but they know who you are.
Absolutely.
They're in the crowd.
Yep.
And then there are people in your church, and these are the disciples. But out of the disciples, there are those who you would be glad to sit on the front porch and have a glass. Now, you're a pastor, you'll sit with anybody, but there are people that you enjoy spending time on the front porch with.
Right.
And then there are people, when they come to your house, they don't get to the front porch. They have refrigerator rights. They come straight in, sit down in the kitchen because they are that close. And I think it's important, as we say relationships, that you don't throw yourself on the altar of, I am open to everybody and there's complete access to my family. To understand that you do need to go to volleyball games, you do need to spend that time, but that you're allowed to have different levels of relationships. Friends, you can't be friends with everybody, or friendship means nothing.
Yeah, and frankly, when I was growing up in the county seat town in the 1960s, my father was an exceptional pastor and a man who deeply loved people. He and my mother were just incredibly hospitable and loved people, but they didn't know how to produce any boundaries. And you actually nailed it. Anybody could walk into our kitchen. Any kids could walk into my room and play with any of my toys. And I remember being resentful of that. I'm not I'm not condemning my parents. I'm just saying that they didn't understand what you just shared, that there are levels of intimacy, and it's okay to have those different levels. It's okay to have some boundaries for your family.
Amen.
You know, I see some guys do two things. They make everybody a boundary, and nobody gets across the threshold.
Right.
Nobody gets into their house. Or they let everybody in. And when you do that, you've got some people who take advantage of that and really begin to disrupt your family. And so we could do a whole podcast just on that, on how to determine those things. But Andy, you are spot on. My dad never really understood what you just said, that Jesus had a obviously the Walmart. I agree with that. People in town would always call him pastor, even though they might be Methodist or not even come to our church. But then, yes, there was a crowd that people think maybe 200 or so disciples that followed Jesus around.
Right.
And then, of course, the 12, and then, of course, within that, the 4, Andrew, Peter, James, and John, but then often just 3, Peter, James, and John.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, there was a special relationship with John because he gave relationship to his mother when he was on the cross.
That's right.
So I think that's a good model for us. I think some guys are all or nothing, and you don't want to do that, and you want to be sensitive to that. But we call this, Andy, emotional intelligence. And I think sometimes it breaks down when pastors don't really develop and cultivate emotional intelligence. They just, you've got to be aware of relationships around you and how to pour into those and how to create boundaries on those that are draining for you. I remember it wouldn't, Richard Blackaby says, I couldn't exist if I didn't tell these stories. And I realize that I tell them all the time. I grew up with Henry. He came to the Home Issue Board a few weeks after I did. When I went on staff there, I was like 26, and he lived in my neighborhood. So, I just grew up with him, and now his son Richard and I are really close friends. But in terms of Blackaby talking about relationships and those kinds of things, I just think the idea that trying to find ways to not let people too much into your home. Richard said that there was a woman who was having some problems in her life, and Henry would meet with her, and then a few days later she would call back with the same problems, and he'd meet with her again and again and again. And
we call those frequent flyers.
Yes. And so one day he said, I don't think he'll mind me telling this because I've already said it. One day he said, when she called, my mother was on the phone. My mother got the phone, and my mother said, she said, is Henry, Dr. Blackaby available? No, he's not here right now. Well, I need to talk to him. And he said, my mother said, well, what did he tell you to do last time you were with him? And she said that. She said, well, he told me I should do this, that, and the other. And then he said, well, Mrs. Blackaby said, well, have you done that? And the lady said, no, I haven't. And she said, well, maybe you should do that before you call back.
Good for her. That's a boundary right there.
And so when Henry got home, she was really nervous. She said, I think I did something wrong and I shouldn't have done it. And she felt real bad about it. But Richard was saying that's a boundary, right?
Absolutely.
We don't need to have another meeting until you do what I asked you to do in this meeting. Maybe, again, that's another podcast we should look at.
It should be. I've actually done the same thing with marriage counseling when they've come in and said, well, you didn't do anything we talked about last time, so we have nothing to talk about this time. Finish that, and then we'll come back and talk. Anyway, but when we talk about boundaries, we want to make sure that it's on both ends. We're dealing with extremes. Guys who you open your life up completely versus shut down everybody. There's this healthy place in between where we understand there are varying levels of relationships. I have a mentor. His name's Glenn Davis. He's the longtime pastor. Now he's an associational mission strategist, or what do we call them? Domes back in the day,
domes,
right?
Always call them domes.
Yeah. Director of associational missions. And he says that churches move at the speed of trust. And I think I love that phrase. And I think about it all the time because you could make a decision. You can have a great idea. You can implement a program, but you're not going to do anything past the speed of trust. And that's why relationships are so important.
And if you break that trust, it's very hard to get that back. So you can preach a bad sermon and recover really well next week. You break someone's trust, you're not going to recover very well very quick.
That's right. Now, because this is the principle, biblical preaching, relationships, and vision, the holy trifecta of a healthy church. The reason that's on our list at Crosspoint, and I will say this, if you're not familiar with our story, again, a declining neighborhood church revitalized in 2002, was only about 100 people. 75% of the church was gone. Now a rural multi-site running close to 3,000 across the state of Kansas. You say, what's the secret sauce? Well, the secret sauce is always Jesus, right? But if you had to look for a human element, I'll tell you what it was. It was the seniors who didn't hold on to things, and they said, do what you need to do. So let me give you a story here real quick. There was a guy in our church. He's passed in the last few years. His name was Earl Ditchin. And one Sunday, we had really started to grow. We had gone from 100 people, suit and tie wearing. There was a day we actually took our ties off as deacons and laid them on the altar and said, we will no longer wear these. And I was doing crazy stuff. Like when I preached, I'd stand on the front pew, and one day I even walked on the back of a couple of them to get attention. And so we were doing this, and church was growing, and there were young couples who had walked in off the bike trail wearing bike shorts and tank tops, and they came to church. There were kids running in church with no shoes on. And it was just a little bedlam, right? Things that were not normal. Well, I remember Earl, I'm a big guy, but he's bigger than I was. He's 6'6", old farmer in his 90s, put his arm around me, wearing a suit. And I didn't even look up at him. I thought, I do not need to know what's coming here. And we're just looking out at this sea of people doing crazy things. And he goes, Pastor, I didn't understand your message today. I really didn't like the worship, and this is uncomfortable. But then he squeezed me and he goes, but look at all these young families. Yeah. He says, you keep doing what you're doing, Pastor. I'm going to Sunday school. Yeah. And it was in that moment that I realized he was voicing for our seniors. There was enough relationship. They love the Lord enough, and they love me enough that they said, this is not for us, but we're so glad God is doing this. And that was the church moving at the speed of trust.
Absolutely. Can you put into as we say, the show notes here, a link to a book that's called by Brian Croft, A Ministry to Widows. It's a little small book, but Brian says the place you often begin in a church revitalization, and that's a lot of guys listening to us in your rural settings need revitalization, is you begin by a ministry to widows and widowers. You invest in those people because they are often the real gatekeepers to the community, gatekeepers to your church, just like that guy was. And we don't intentionally oftentimes really spend time with widows and widowers. Simple things like you find out when their wedding anniversary would be, and you send them a note and maybe some flowers on that day and say, I know this is an especially hard day for you. Those kinds of things, and spending time with them and talking to them, and just a ministry to widows is a really important thing to do to help build those kinds of relationships, because then they'll talk well about you to other people.
Right. You don't move matriarchs and patriarchs with programs and edicts.
When I went to Warnell in Kansas City, there was 18, as I said, elderly folks left, and they would talk to me about the previous pastors, and they kind of had them pegged. This one was, this guy, he was so gracious. He sent thank you notes. He was always there. This guy was always closed off in his office, never talked to anybody. I mean, they had identified the pastors in the past who were good relational, and the ones that had good relationships, they talked about with real affection. The others, they just sort of talked about coldly. And I can't tell you how ultimately important it is for you to be able to have good relationships and to develop those. And there's nothing short of spending time with them, as we said before, doing what they like to do, engaged in their life, listening to them, asking them to tell them your stories, and just pouring into them and just ministering to them. Guys, so many times, if you had a young couple, and here I'm at Linwood, it's here, town of 400, and we got a few new houses being built around our town. And sure enough, we got this wonderful young couple that got a new home, and they started coming, and they're just this really great young couple. And of course, when a young couple like that comes in, they're newly married, they're professionals, and you just want to spend time with them, you want to get to know them. You think, what about the 86-year-old lady who's been here for 40 years? Do I feel the same urgency to get to know her that I do that 22-year-old couple that just built a new house down the street? Why not? I mean, that's the importance I'm talking about.
And if you'll give me that link, I'll put that in the show notes, as well as that Lifeway research document on the relationships every pastor should have. There's so much more we could talk about this. Again, it's kind of like one of your sermonisms, but that's another sermon. That's another podcast. We're gonna have to take this even further. But let me give you a word of scripture that will support this, because we're not proof texting. We are taking the text as proof for life here at it is. Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. That's our commitment. That is our command to make sure that we remember ministry is a team sport, and we don't do this alone. We do this as a church, as we lead a church. So make sure you're in that relationship place. Next week, we're going to talk about vision. You excited about talking about vision next week?
I'm excited about talking about vision. I'm excited about talking with anything with you. I'm just excited to be in your presence, Andy. I just really am.
Yeah, that we're done.
I am.
I love you, brother. I love you.
I love you, bro.
What a great opportunity. We thank you for joining us here at the Rural Pastor Podcast. Please comment, share, help us grow this community. We believe in you and what you're doing and look forward to what God has in store for all of us at the ruralpastorpodcast.com.
Like the prophet Jeremiah, you may be the one to go to the dying and the broken with a message of hope. To that church on the corner of that forgotten little town, to a room of empty pews where his love can still be found. You may never know of all the seeds you've sown, but it just takes one willing soul to make him known.
Thank you so much for joining us at the ruralpastorpodcast.com. A special thanks to Chosen Road for this incredible theme music, to 180 Digital, our corporate sponsor, and you can check out both of them at our website as well as other resources, because you're not alone. And Rural Pastor, we believe in you at the ruralpastorpodcast.com.